The apartment was perfect. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a glittering skyline, marble countertops catching the afternoon light. A minimalist aesthetic that whispered wealth without screaming it. She reclined on a cream linen sofa, one leg extended, the other bent at an angle that photographers call the casual sprawl, the kind of posture that takes 30 minutes to arrange naturally. The camera lingered on her face, serene, unbothered, the expression of someone for whom penthouses were merely backdrops to her actual life. 300,000 people watched that video in the first 24 hours. But the penthouse didn't belong to her. It wasn't even her for the weekend. It was an Airbnb, rented for 4 hours at a cost of $1,200. The photographer a freelancer she'd hired through a gig platform shot in bursts while she held that pose. 73 images. She'd select 3, edit them into a cohesive aesthetic, and upload them across 5 platforms with captions about finding peace in luxury and understanding what really matters. What mattered was the mathematics of attention. Each photograph was a calculated variable in an algorithm that had learned to recognize what made people stop scrolling and start believing. 2 months later, that same penthouse appeared in a real estate listing. A couple considering the purchase took a virtual tour and noticed something odd in the background of a professional shot. A woman on a cream linen sofa, one leg extended, the other bent at an angle that suggested expensive leisure. They recognized her immediately. Everyone did. She had 4.7 million followers. Her life had become a template for aspiration. They mentioned it to a friend. The friend shared it online. By morning, thousands of people were comparing images, tracing the furniture, noting the identical abstract painting on the wall. The Airbnb's listing number was visible in one post's metadata. A hotel in Dubai that she'd claimed to visit weekly had no record of her ever checking in. The car she posed beside in 17 different locations belonged to a rental company. The Hermes bags, reverse image searched, originated from a wholesale distributor in Shanghai. The empire didn't collapse slowly. It unraveled in hours. But before the collapse, there was the construction. Before the exposure, there was the woman who had learned, somewhere along the way, that the self you present to the world is more real than the self you live with in silence. She had discovered that authenticity was a luxury fewer people wanted than she'd imagined, and that the hunger for curated perfection was infinite. This is the story of how someone becomes a lie so completely that the truth becomes something she can no longer recognize. This is the story of what happens when the gap between the person you are and the person you pretend to be becomes so vast that falling into it destroys everything around you. This is the story of identity, aspiration, algorithmic persuasion, and the moment when the internet became the detective and justice became indistinguishable from vengeance. What does this tell us about the distance between authenticity and performance, and why we're all susceptible to both? Before she was a luxury icon, she was unremarkable in a way that only daughters of middle-class families can understand. Her childhood home in a suburban development outside a mid-sized city was neither poor nor wealthy. The grass was mowed on schedule. The car in the driveway was sensible. Her mother worked in pharmaceutical sales. Her father managed logistics for a distribution center. They loved her in the manner of people who believed that consistency, responsibility, and quiet competence were the foundations of a good life. She was not a beautiful child. She was not unpopular. She occupied the exact center of normalcy present in school photographs, without being remarkable. Invited to parties without being essential, liked by most people without being particularly loved by anyone. This is its own form of invisibility. The first wound wasn't traumatic. It was the accumulation of small recognitions that she was not the kind of person people remembered. She could spend an hour in conversation with a peer and watch that peer forget her name by the next week. She could make a joke that landed adequately and watch the credit migrate to someone more charismatic. She existed in photographs like a person exists in a crowd visible but inconsequential. Her parents noticed this quietness, this tendency toward self-effacement. They responded with encouragement that felt, to her, like pity. "You have so much to offer," her mother would say, a statement that implied she wasn't currently offering it. You just need confidence, her father would suggest, which meant you are failing to be confident, and that failure is your responsibility. She internalized the message that her fundamental nature, careful, observational, slightly withdrawn, was a flaw in need of correction. Adolescence crystallized this wound. The girls around her seemed to possess an innate understanding of how to translate themselves into social currency. They learned the grammar of attraction, the syntax of belonging. She studied their behavior like a linguist studying a foreign language, observing the rules, understanding the structure, but unable to achieve native fluency. When she tried to perform confidence, it emerged as stiffness. When she attempted boldness, it read as desperation. She discovered early that people preferred the version of her that she could control. In writing, she was articulate. In solitude, she could construct a self that felt coherent. In the privacy of her bedroom, she could imagine a person who was compelling, magnetic, worthy of remembrance. That imagined self felt more real than the one who walked through hallways and disappeared into the demographic noise. The internet arrived as permission. Initially, it was just a diary, a live journal, kept at 13, where she wrote observations about books and adolescent confusion. The observations were good. People read them. People commented. For the first time, she experienced the sensation of being known for something other than proximity. Her words created recognition. Her insights created connection. She learned the architecture of online presence. She learned that the self you present in text could be more authentically you than the self you presented in person. Or at least, it could be a more intentional, refined version of you. The internet didn't require the social fluency she lacked. It required articulation, aesthetic sensibility, and consistency, all things she could manufacture. By her late teens, she had accumulated a small following on multiple platforms. She wrote about fashion, about urban exploration, about the psychology of aspiration. Her audience grew, not explosively, but steadily. People found her refreshing intelligent without being academic, observational without being bitter, aspirational without being obviously desperate. She had created a voice that was compelling precisely because it seemed authentic. And it seemed authentic because she had spent thousands of hours perfecting it. But the following plateaued. There was a ceiling at 10,000 followers, then 30,000, then 60. She noticed that the people who grew exponentially weren't necessarily smarter or more eloquent. They were visually distinctive. They were beautiful, or they were rich, or they had access to experiences that seemed enviable. They were not her. She was 23 when she made the decision, though she wouldn't have framed it as a decision. It felt more like recognition, the understanding that the self she had been constructing all her life had been moving in a single direction, and she had only been moving gradually toward the inevitable conclusion. She began to curate, not her thoughts, those had always been curated, but her life. She researched the most photogenic neighborhoods in her city and began taking photos there, in clothes she couldn't afford, but had borrowed or purchased on credit. She learned the angles that made her face more striking, the lighting that suggested a certain aesthetic sophistication. She studied the feeds of people with millions of followers and reverse-engineered their visual language, the color palettes, the composition, the subtle markers of wealth and leisure. The transformation was gradual. Over 6 months, her feed evolved from introspective commentary to lifestyle documentation. Over a year, she had developed a visual identity that was distinctive, cohesive, and aspirational. Her follower count began to climb again. 50,000, 100,000, 200,000. At no point did she think of what she was doing as deception. She thought of it as finally becoming the person she had always been capable of being. The self she had imagined in solitude was being translated into public form. Was that a lie? Or was it authenticity finally arriving at the surface? The first brand reached out when she had 300,000 followers. They offered her $2,000 to post a photograph with their luxury handbag. She accepted. The photograph was beautiful. The engagement was high. The transaction felt like validation proof that her intuition about what people wanted was correct. More brands reached out. Jewelry companies, travel agencies, luxury hotels offering free stays in exchange for photographs that would make their destinations seem essential to a cultivated life. She began to realize that the gap between having an audience and having an income was not as wide as she'd believed. If she could convince people that she lived a certain way, people would pay her to represent that way to others. What she had failed to understand in the beginning was that once you've built a self entirely from aesthetic choice and curated experience, you can no longer distinguish between the self that performs and the self that is. The woman who borrowed luxury apartments for 4-hour photo shoots wasn't a deceptive woman pretending to be wealthy. She was a woman who had decided that the aesthetic of wealth was more real than the material fact of it. She was a woman who had discovered that in the age of the image was the economy. She had created a monster, but she had created it so carefully over so many years, with such intentionality, that when it finally began to move and speak and accumulate power, she couldn't see it as separate from herself. She thought she was becoming. She didn't yet understand that she was disappearing. Why did millions of people believe in her? This is the question that deserves examination, because the deceiver's power lies not in the strength of the lie, but in the depth of the hunger the lie satisfies. Humans are creatures structured by narrative. We don't experience life as raw data. We experience it as a story in which we are the protagonist. We are constantly telling ourselves accounts of who we are, what we deserve, and what is possible. These narratives require validation. When we encounter someone living a story we've imagined for ourselves, we experience a particular kind of recognition. This is not manipulation. This is resonance. She understood intuitively that people didn't want to believe in her because she was extraordinary. They wanted to believe in her because she made the life they imagined seem achievable. She wasn't a billionaire heir to an empire. She was a young woman who had figured out how to live like one. This was far more dangerous than inherited wealth. Inherited wealth has the excuse of luck. She represented the seductive possibility that the life of luxury was merely a series of choices, aesthetic decisions, and personal discipline away. Her photographs presented a grammar of aspiration that was linguistically perfect. Each image contained several vocabulary words that readers had learned to recognize as success. The minimalist apartment, the luxury handbag, the champagne on a terrace, the casual access to experiences most people saved money for years to afford. But more importantly, each image contained a narrative truth. She was never photographed drunk or desperate. She was never caught in an unflattering moment. She was never tired or uncertain or struggling. She was, in every image, the person the viewer longed to become. The psychological mechanism here is not mysterious. It's called parasocial relationship, the one-way attachment we form to people whose lives we observe repeatedly. Unlike traditional relationships, parasocial attachments require nothing from the observer except attention. The person you're parasocially attached doesn't know you exist, but you know them. You have watched them navigate life. You have learned their aesthetic preferences, their values, their personality. Over months and years, this person becomes a fixture in your consciousness. They become, in some psychological sense, a friend. But she offered something more than friendship. She offered a map. Her followers could look at her life and see a pathway to their own imagined futures. The specific brands she wore, they could purchase. The specific neighborhoods she frequented, they could visit. The specific aesthetic she cultivated, they could replicate. She was not a fantasy. She was a template. And templates are far more dangerous because they suggest a kind of replicability. If she could become this version of herself, the logic went, then so could you. The parasocial nature of the relationship also meant that her followers had no way to verify her authenticity through the normal channels of human connection. You can't ask a person you follow on the internet whether they're being honest. You can't read their body language in a conversation. You can only compare what they present to you with the narrative you've constructed about how someone in their position would behave. And she had learned this narrative perfectly. Consider the question, what does a person with unlimited resources and excellent taste do with their time? The answer, she understood, was not actually whatever they want. It was specific things that other wealthy people do and that photographs well. The wealthy take yoga classes in sunset light. They eat at restaurants with interior design worth remarking upon. They travel to cities that are visually distinctive. They wear clothes that suggest restraint rather than excess. They accumulate experiences rather than possessions. She had no money, but she had research skills and a credit card. She could book a boutique hotel for one night and photograph herself in the lobby. She could purchase expensive clothing, photograph herself wearing it, and return it to the store. She could spend an afternoon in a luxury neighborhood taking hundreds of photographs and select the 12 that made her life appear uninterrupted by financial constraint. The effort itself was immense. A single photograph that appeared casual, a shot of her with a cappuccino, looking out a cafe window with the kind of thoughtful expression that suggests depth might require 4 hours of setup, travel, coordination with a photographer, multiple outfit changes, and the establishment of visual consistency with her previous 50 posts. The labor was invisible. Only the result remained. What her followers were seeing then was not dishonesty layered over an authentic self. It was the product of intensive work toward a singular vision. She was not lazy or unmotivated. She was extraordinarily disciplined. She was, in a real sense, brilliant. She understood marketing, visual composition, psychology, and the grammar of aspiration better than people who had gone to business school for it. Her deception was not the laziness of someone fabricating a reality. It was the precision of someone willing to labor endlessly to produce a consistent, compelling image. And this is what made her dangerous, because she wasn't just presenting a lie. She was presenting an expertly crafted simulation of what people wanted to believe was possible. Every detail was correct. The color of the walls in the background, consistent with high-end interior design trends. The brands visible on tables, carefully selected to communicate cultural capital without screaming for attention. The expressions on her face, suggesting a kind of serene contentment that implied she had solved something the rest of us hadn't. Her followers were not stupid. They were not gullible. They were simply human, and they were engaging in a very human behavior. The desire to believe that the good life is possible, and the desperate willingness to accept any evidence that it might be. She provided evidence. Carefully curated, beautifully composed evidence. But evidence nonetheless. There's also the question of what her followers were getting from the relationship, which deserves acknowledgement. When you follow someone, when you observe their life, when you incorporate their aesthetic choices into your own, you are participating in something that feels like connection. You are part of a community of people who recognize and value the same things. You are, in some sense, like her. Or you might be, if you made the right choices. If you purchased the right handbag. If you saved enough to visit that restaurant. If you became disciplined enough to radiate that kind of serenity. This is the deeper truth about parasocial relationships with luxury influencers. They are not purely parasitic. They offer something. They offer direction. They offer permission. They offer the comforting belief that the life of luxury is not something you're inherently excluded from. It's something you're not motivated or disciplined enough to achieve yet. And that belief, that fantasy of future possibility, has psychological value. It's comforting. It's motivating. It's worth paying attention for. So when she posted a photograph of herself in a penthouse, followers didn't just see a space. They saw a reflection of their own ambitions. When she posted a photograph of her wearing a specific brand, followers didn't just see clothing. They saw a transaction they could replicate. When she posted a photograph of herself at a luxury hotel, followers didn't just see a location. They saw proof that the fantasy was real, that the life was possible, that people like them, young, ambitious, beautiful, in a very specific and replicable way, could have it. She had become a mirror, but not an honest mirror. She was a mirror that only reflected the version of the viewer they wanted to be, and she showed them that version as a reality that had already been achieved. What would you have done differently, watching someone seemingly achieve the life you'd imagined? How many red flags would you have noticed before the investment in believing became too great to admit doubt? The technical work of creating a false life is in many ways more interesting than the life itself, because the life, the actual lived experience, was secondary to the construction. What mattered was the photograph. What mattered was the digital representation. The physical reality was only important insofar as it could be converted into image and distributed. She developed a system. Every week, she identified 3 to 5 locations that would photograph well and that aligned with her current narrative. The narrative shifted. Sometimes she was a woman devoted to minimalist wellness, documenting her yoga practice and her carefully plated meals. Sometimes she was a luxury traveler, documenting access to hotels and experiences. Sometimes she was a cultural enthusiast, photographing herself at galleries and exclusive events. The narrative wasn't random. It was designed to match whatever brands were currently interested in paying for her image. The process began with research. She would spend hours identifying Airbnbs in her city that were expensive enough to photograph as luxury apartments, but accessible enough to be rentable for short periods. She developed relationships with photographers who were willing to shoot her on limited budgets, understanding that if she looked wealthy enough, they'd be willing to work at reduced rates in exchange for the prestige of being associated with a major influencer. She learned which luxury hotels offered Instagram experiences, complimentary stays in exchange for photographic content. She mapped neighborhoods known for high-end aesthetic, places where the architecture itself communicated wealth. The execution required a kind of choreography. She would arrive at a location with a specific vision for how the space should be photographed. She understood composition in a technical sense, the rule of thirds, the use of leading lines, the way light moved through a space at different times of day. She understood which angles made spaces look larger, which perspectives made her face look more striking. She understood the psychology of color, how warm tones communicated intimacy, how cool tones communicated sophistication. A single day of shooting could generate content for 3 weeks. She might spend 4 hours in an Airbnb apartment working with a photographer to create 20 distinct photographs. Each photograph would be taken multiple times, from multiple angles, with adjustments to lighting and positioning. The best shots would be edited, color-corrected, and filtered to match the aesthetic of her feed. Some would be posted immediately. Others would be saved for strategic moments, when engagement rates were low and the algorithm needed feeding. The physical exhaustion of this was real, though it was never visible in the final product. She would spend 12 hours per week on this work. She would drive to locations, collaborate with photographers, arrange her face and body into specific positions, hold poses for minutes at a time, smile on command. The labor was invisible because labor was not part of the narrative. The narrative suggested ease, spontaneity, a life so luxurious that documentation of it was simply a natural byproduct of living. What distinguished her from other influencers was her attention to consistency. She understood that the audience's belief in her life depended not on any single photograph being perfect, but on the entire feed telling a coherent story. The colors needed to match. The aesthetic needed to be internally consistent. The narrative needed to develop logically. A photograph of her in a casual neighborhood one week, followed by a photograph of her in a luxury penthouse the next week was fine. But a photograph of her in a fast casual restaurant, followed by a photograph of her in fine dining, needed to be explained, perhaps through a caption about enjoying all kinds of experiences, or finding luxury in unexpected places. The narrative had to make sense. She also understood the mathematics of the algorithm. The Instagram algorithm, and others like it, reward engagement. Engagement comes from posts that generate comments and shares. Certain topics generate more engagement than others. Aspirational content, slightly ambiguous captions that invited interpretation, and subtle vulnerability all performed well. So she began to weave elements of pseudo-confession into her posts. Finally taking a break from the chaos of my schedule, she'd write, accompanying a photograph of herself meditating in a luxury spa. Sometimes I forget why I'm working so hard until I see this view. She'd caption an image of herself on a terrace overlooking a city. These captions suggested that even someone living the aspirational life struggled, that even luxury came with its own kind of fatigue, that there was a real person underneath the presentation. This was crucial. The fiction worked precisely because it contained elements of truth. She was tired. She was struggling to maintain the image. She was sometimes feeling hollow and uncertain about who she actually was. These real emotions were sewn into the fabric of the lie, which made the lie feel more authentic. She wasn't pretending that her life was perfect. She was pretending that the life was real while being honest about the existential complexity of living it. The architecture of the illusion extended to the infrastructure as well. She created multiple email addresses associated with different brand partnerships. She built a fake media kit, a document that purported to describe her audience demographics, engagement rates, and cultural reach. These numbers were fabricated, but they were fabricated in a way that seemed believable. She claimed 4.7 million followers, which was real. She claimed an average engagement rate of 8.3%, which was inflated but not impossible. She claimed that her audience was 73% female, aged 18 to 35, with an average household income above $75,000. This demographic profile was based on aspirational marketing research. She knew what profile luxury brands wanted to believe they were reaching, and she simply matched that profile. Brands didn't verify these metrics carefully. Verification would have required them to conduct independent analysis, which would have been labor-intensive and skeptical in a way that seemed unnecessary. Instead, they trusted the media kit. They trusted the appearance of her account. They trusted the sheer number of her followers, which itself seemed like proof of authenticity. Why would someone have 4.7 million followers if they weren't who they claimed to be? This is where institutional power structures become complicit in the deception. Brands are built on the assumption that digital metrics equal real influence. They have no practical way to verify authenticity at scale. They rely on automated systems and third-party verification services, most of which can be gamed or faked. A woman with millions of followers is, by definition in the digital world, a trustworthy brand partner. The equation is so simple that questioning it seems paranoid. So when luxury hotels began offering her free stays, she was able to leverage those stays into photographs that made her appear more affluent than she was. When fashion brands began sending her clothes worth thousands of dollars, she was able to wear them once, photograph them in aesthetically perfect circumstances, and return them. She was getting paid to be a curator, a filter, a validator of the brand's own self-image. She was saying to the world, these luxury experiences are real, these products are worthy of desire, and access to them is possible. The illusion was also constructed through strategic relationships. She cultivated friendships with other influencers, photographers, and people with access to luxury spaces. She was not actually wealthy, but she could access the social networks of people who were. She could attend parties because someone else invited her. She could photograph herself in exclusive restaurants because she'd built relationships with people who worked there. She could access private beach clubs and luxury events because she was useful to the people who ran them. Her presence and her photographs added cultural cachet. There was also the question of what she was consuming to maintain the image. She spent money she didn't have. She had multiple credit cards, each one carrying a debt that she rotated by opening new accounts and transferring balances. She took out loans using false income documentation. She lied to lenders about her revenue, claiming that the brand partnerships generated far more income than they actually did. The financial machinery underlying the image was as much a lie as the image itself, but it was an invisible lie. It happened in spreadsheets and emails to creditors. It didn't appear in photographs. By the end, she owed approximately $300,000 in unsecured debt. She had used 3 different names for credit applications. She had falsified tax documents. She had, in a technical sense, committed fraud multiple times over. But none of this appeared in the photograph of her with the champagne glass, looking serenely out a penthouse window. The architecture of the illusion was, in truth, far more impressive than any authentic luxury. An actual wealthy person might simply live. They might take photographs casually and post them without aesthetic consideration. They might visit places for pleasure rather than documentation. The work of creating the illusion, the labor, the precision, the psychological sophistication, it was all far more demanding and simply living the life she was pretending to live. This raises a deeper question. At what point does the work of maintaining an image become more real than the image itself? At what point does the effort to appear to be something transform you into something else, entirely not the thing you're pretending to be, but a new kind of being entirely, one that exists only in service to its own representation? She was not living a luxury life, but she was working harder than almost anyone actually living that life could imagine. Can you recognize the moment where discipline becomes obsession, where curation becomes deception, where the labor of maintaining an image becomes the full substance of existence? The first major brand collaboration happened when she had 350,000 followers. It was a luxury jewelry company, relatively young, positioning itself at the intersection of sustainability and high-end design. Their chief marketing officer had been scrolling through Instagram the way marketing executives do, looking for cultural trends and emerging influence when she appeared in a Discover feed. The brand conducted what they believed to be research. They looked at her follower count. They examined her engagement rates. They reviewed her aesthetic, which aligned perfectly with their own, minimalist, sustainable, suggesting a kind of enlightened luxury that appealed to people who wanted to feel sophisticated and ethical simultaneously. They sent an email to the business account listed on her profile. They offered $5,000 for a single photograph featuring their flagship necklace. She accepted within an hour. The necklace was shipped to her directly. It was, she discovered upon opening the package, genuinely beautiful, a handcrafted piece of white gold and diamond, the kind of thing that might retail for $8,000. She held it for a long time, understanding the weight of what it meant. A brand had trusted her. A brand had looked at her presentation and decided that she was worth investing in. The necklace was not just a product, it was validation. It was proof that she had succeeded in convincing people that she was someone worth believing in. She photographed the necklace with the same precision she applied to everything. She shot it in different lighting conditions. She photographed it on her skin, catching the way the diamond caught light. She photographed it alongside other luxury items she'd acquired through brand partnerships, a silk scarf, a luxury watch, a designer bag. The final image was spare and elegant, the necklace resting on her collarbone, her hand raised to touch it, her expression one of delicate appreciation. The caption read, "There's something about finding a piece that feels like it was made for you." Grateful for the craftsmanship behind every detail, the image performed spectacularly. It received 200,000 likes in the first 48 hours. The engagement rate was nearly 9% far higher than the claimed rate in her media kit, but the brand didn't question this. In fact, the high performance validated their decision to work with her. They had chosen correctly. They had identified emerging influence before it became mainstream. More importantly, the post drove traffic to the brand's website. People who had seen the photograph clicked through to learn more about the necklace. Some purchased it. The brand tracked this. They could see that her image had generated direct revenue. They weren't just paying for an advertisement. They were paying for a sales channel that actually converted. Within 2 weeks, she received another offer, then another. A luxury skincare brand wanted her to document her skincare routine. A boutique hotel in Miami wanted her to spend a weekend and photograph herself in their suites. A wine retailer wanted her to photograph herself enjoying their products. The offers came faster and faster, each one more lucrative than the last. A single post could now generate $10,000 to $25,000, depending on the brand and the requirements. She was genuinely now a business. She had an income that exceeded what she could have earned in most entry-level professional positions. She had access to products and experiences that most people saved money for years to afford. She had validated proof that her strategy had worked. She had become, in the eyes of the market, who she'd been pretending to be. But something happened at this moment, something subtle and psychological. The distinction between the person she was pretending to be and the person she actually was began to dissolve in a way that was genuinely disorienting. She had access to luxury products. She had access to luxury experiences. When a hotel offered her a free stay, she could genuinely stay there. When a brand sent her a handbag, she could genuinely carry it. The pretense and the reality began to overlap, yet it wasn't quite real. The handbag would need to be returned or sold to pay down debt. The hotel stay came with an obligation to photograph it in a specific way. Nothing she had access to was actually hers in the way that true luxury is. Everything was contingent. Everything was performance. But it was real performance now. Real access, real engagement with luxury items. She wasn't just photographing fake penthouses. She was photographing fake penthouses that she'd rented with money she'd earned by convincing people to believe in her image. The circularity was dizzying. There's a psychological phenomenon called cognitive dissonance. Discomfort we experience when holding contradictory beliefs or when our actions don't align with our values. She was experiencing the reverse. She was becoming so skilled at aligning her actions with a specific belief system, the belief system of the wealthy, cultured, successful woman, that the dissonance between her action and her authentic identity almost disappeared. She wasn't two people anymore. She was becoming one person, and that person was the one she'd constructed. The brands that were now paying her didn't know this, of course. They believed they'd discovered an authentic voice, an actual person living the life they were marketing. They believed her testimony when she said she loved their products, that she was genuinely aligned with their values. And in a strange way, she did love the products. She had taught herself to. The cognitive dissonance had resolved itself by simply accepting the performance as truth. The money was also intoxicating in ways she hadn't anticipated. She began to spend more freely. She purchased things she didn't strictly need. She took a trip to Morocco, not for a brand partnership, but for herself. She got her nails done at a salon that cost $100 per appointment. She bought expensive coffee. She permitted herself small luxuries that she'd previously only allowed in photograph form. And as she spent more money, the distinction between the persona and the person narrowed further. More importantly, she had begun to need this income. The debt that had funded the initial illusion was being serviced by the income that the illusion generated. She was trapped in a closed loop. She needed to maintain the image because the image was now her only source of income. The brands paying her didn't care about the real person underneath. They cared about the image, the presentation, the ability to convince the world to buy what they were selling. If she stopped performing, if she admitted that the life was constructed, she would lose everything. This is the turning point where the deceiver discovers that they've created not just an illusion, but a dependency. The lie is no longer something they can choose to stop. It's become the fundamental structure of their existence. Maintaining the image is not optional. It's survival. A woman named Kayla, a follower from Colorado, commented on one of her photographs. "You give me hope that I can have this life too. Watching your journey makes me believe it's possible." The comment generated a warm feeling. It also generated a cold knot of guilt. She had built a relationship with Kayla based on a falsehood. Kayla was aspiring toward a life that didn't exist. Kayla was making decisions, spending money she was saving, deferring other dreams based on the belief that the template was real and replicable. But she didn't acknowledge this guilt. She doubled down. She responded to Kayla's comment with encouragement. "You absolutely can. It's about commitment and vision. I believe in you." This response generated more engagement. Other followers saw it and commented their own affirmations. The story of Kayla's journey toward the aspirational life became part of the community narrative. Kayla had become a character in the drama, a follower, becoming a believer, becoming a participant. Kayla, in her real life, went without coffee for a month and put the savings into a luxury handbag that the influencer had promoted. Kayla posted a photograph of it, tagged her, and waited for acknowledgement. The influencer never responded, though she saw the post. She scrolled past it because responding would have required engaging with the reality of what she'd done. She scrolled past Kayla's post in the same way she scrolled past any contradiction to the narrative she'd constructed. The first brand that believed in her had opened a door. She had walked through it and discovered that on the other side was not actually a luxury life, but a kind of gilded cage of space where she had access to the products and experiences of luxury without actually being safe, without actually being secure, without actually being able to stop She had become a prisoner of her own image, and the prison had been built brick by brick from the admiration of people who never questioned whether it was real. Did it occur to her that she should confess that at each moment of acceptance, each moment of success, she could have chosen differently? Can someone ever step out of a role they've learned to play so perfectly that it's indistinguishable from self? To understand the psychology of the follower, you must understand the psychology of aspiration in late capitalism. You must understand what happens when the good life is defined primarily in terms of consumption and presentation, and when the primary evidence of having achieved the good life is the ability to document and distribute that achievement to others. She had followers from every continent, from every socioeconomic background, but they shared something. They were all engaged in a particular kind of transaction with her. They were trading attention hours of their lives spent observing her, thinking about her, internalizing her aesthetic for the promise that she represented. The promise was this: the life you imagine is possible. It might take work. It might require discipline. It might require making choices you haven't made yet. But it is possible, and here is what it looks like when someone achieves it. This was the bargain. And it was a bargain that felt fair to both parties, even though it was predicated on a fundamental lie. The followers were not stupid. They understood, at some level, that what they were seeing was a curation. They understood that Instagram was not a documentary. They understood that no one posted photographs of themselves, crying or struggling or eating a basic meal alone in a rented apartment. They understood the selection bias. Only the good moments made it to the grid. But understanding something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are different processes. So the followers engaged in a kind of agreed-upon delusion. They accepted that what they were seeing was curated, but they also accepted the implicit claim that the curation was true, that the life they were seeing was genuinely the life she was living, just with the bad moments edited out. They accepted that she was, fundamentally, a real person living a beautiful life, and they were following documentation of that life. This mattered enormously, because if she were just a construction, just an invented persona with no basis in reality, then the relationship would feel hollow. But if she was a real person choosing to share the best version of her real life, then the relationship felt meaningful. The followers needed her to be real. They needed to believe that the life was genuine, because if it wasn't, then what were they aspiring toward? Nothing. They would be aspiring toward nothing. And aspiration is a psychological need as real as hunger. The followers fell into several categories. There were the aspirational followers, young women primarily, aged 18 to 32, who were using the image as a template for their own lives. They would screenshot her outfits and purchase versions of them from faster fashion brands. They would save pictures of apartments she'd photographed and use them as inspiration when decorating their own spaces. They would note the restaurants she visited and add them to their own bucket lists. She was, essentially, a personal assistant to their aspirations. She was doing the work of imagining, curating, and validating a life that her followers could then attempt to replicate at their own economic level. There were the aspirational plus followers people who had the economic means to pursue some of what she posted about, but who lacked the cultural knowledge or the confidence to do so independently. For them, she was a guide to cultural capital. She was teaching them what wealthy, cultured people knew, which restaurants were actually good, which neighborhoods were actually worth visiting, which brands were actually worth the money. By following her, they were essentially paying for a tutor in how to be the right kind of wealthy. There were the voyeuristic followers people who would never aspire to the life she documented, but who were fascinated by it. For them, the appeal was anthropological. They were observing a life so different from their own that it seemed almost fictional. She was a window into a world they would never inhabit, and that window was intoxicating. And there were the parasocial obsessive followers. These were people who had become genuinely emotionally attached to her. They spent hours looking at her photographs, reading her captions, examining the details of her life. They created imaginary conversations with her. They knew her preferences, her apparent values, her aesthetic sensibilities. They felt, in a real psychological sense, that they knew her. They believed that if they ever met her in person, they would recognize her, and she would recognize something in them. They believed that their relationship, though one-directional and impossible, was nonetheless real. All of these followers needed her lie for different reasons. The aspirational followers needed to believe that the life was possible. The aspirational plus followers needed to believe that they were getting access to real knowledge about culture and status. The voyeuristic followers needed to believe that the world was fascinating and stratified in the way her image suggested. The parasocial followers needed to believe that she was a real person with a real life, not a construction, because their emotional attachment required that. The bargain, from her perspective, was simple. In exchange for maintaining the image, she would receive attention, validation, and income. But the followers were also getting something, and they were paying for it with their time, their emotional investment, and often their money. They were paying for the promise that if they aspired hard enough, if they made the right choices, if they spent money on the right things, they could become like her. This is where the ethical complexity of the situation becomes apparent. She was not merely deceiving people. She was facilitating their self-deception. Her followers wanted to be deceived. They wanted to believe in the image. They wanted to believe that the barrier between their current life and the aspirational life was merely a matter of will and discipline and the right consumer choices. Admitting that the image was false would have required them to confront the possibility that the aspiration was itself false, that the life she represented was not actually achievable through the mechanisms they believed in. So when contradictions appeared, when someone noticed that she'd posted photographs from the same Airbnb at different times claiming it was her primary residence, or when someone did the math on her timeline and realized she'd claimed to be in two places simultaneously, the followers would rationalize. Maybe she owned the apartment and rented it out sometimes. Maybe the photos were from different time periods and she just posted them out of order. Maybe she had multiple homes. The explanations were generous because the followers were invested in continuing to believe. There's a psychological principle called motivated reasoning, the tendency to process information in ways that align with our existing beliefs and desires. Her followers were practicing motivated reasoning at a grand scale. They were engaging in cognitive gymnastics to maintain the belief in her authenticity, because the alternative acknowledging that the image was false was psychologically unbearable. If the image was false, then the aspiration was false. And if the aspiration was false, then what had they been doing all this time? What had they been wanting? The bargain also had a temporal component. Followers believed that the image represented the future, not just the present. They believed that they were observing who they could become if they made the right choices. This future-oriented belief was crucial. She was not just showing them a life that existed in the present. She was showing them a life that they could achieve in the future. This meant that contradictions in the present could be easily rationalized as stages in the journey. Maybe she'd started with less and worked up to where she was now. Maybe she'd failed before and was now succeeding. The narrative could encompass most inconsistencies because the followers were looking forward, not scrutinizing the present. There was also the question of what the followers were getting away with. By following her, by aspiring to her aesthetic, by purchasing the products she recommended, they were engaging in a very specific kind of consumer behavior. They were not just buying products. They were buying the feeling of being on the path toward a better life. This feeling was valuable. It made them feel less stuck, less resigned to their current circumstances. It made them feel like agents of their own transformation rather than victims of circumstance. The lie was serving a psychological function. It was providing hope. A woman named Jennifer, a follower from Texas with 2 children and a job at a pharmacy, had taken one of her photographs of a minimalist kitchen and spent months redecorating her own kitchen to match the aesthetic. The new kitchen cost her about $8,000. She couldn't quite afford it, so she put it on a credit card. She took photographs of her new kitchen and posted them, crediting the influencer for the inspiration. The new kitchen made her feel wealthier. It made her feel like she was, in some sense, aspiring successfully. It made her feel less like a pharmacy technician, living a small life, and more like a woman engaged in intentional self-creation. Jennifer never knew that the minimalist kitchen she'd been aspiring toward belonged to a $4,000 Airbnb rental. that it existed only for the duration of a photo shoot, that it had never been anyone's actual home. Jennifer needed the lie. Without it, her redecorated kitchen was just expensive consumer spending she couldn't afford. With it, the kitchen was part of a journey toward a better life. This is what the followers' bargain actually was. Followers traded their attention and their faith for permission to believe in the possibility of transformation. She provided that permission at a massive scale to millions of people. And the bargain worked until it didn't, until the moment when the contradiction became too large to rationalize, when the evidence of deception became impossible to integrate into the narrative that made the entire arrangement meaningful. When that moment came, the followers would experience not just betrayal, but a kind of existential vertigo. If she wasn't real, then what had they been aspiring toward? If the image was false, then what did that say about their own aspirations? If the life was constructed, then could their lives built on the template she'd provided be anything other than constructions as well? How many of her followers were living lives they hadn't chosen, spending money they didn't have, pursuing a version of transformation that never actually existed? And how complicit were they in their own deception, given how desperately they wanted to believe? Details are the enemy of deception. This is the fundamental principle that underlies all detection. A lie can be sustained at a conceptual level. The story can be coherent. The narrative can make sense. But the details, the specific, concrete, material details become points of vulnerability. Because details exist in the physical world, and the physical world can be cross-referenced, verified, measured against other physical things. She had been extraordinarily careful with details. She understood that her entire empire rested on the reliability of small things. The way light fell through a window, the specific brand of coffee cup, the color of the throw pillows on a sofa. These details, correctly chosen, created the illusion of authenticity. A room that is generically nice looks like a staged space. A room that has the right books on the shelf, the right plants, the right art, the right throw pillows. That room looks like someone lives there. It looks like a person's home. So when she photographed the Airbnb penthouses, she paid attention to these details. She noted the specific furniture, the art on the walls, the decorative objects. She ensured that when she edited the photographs, these details were crisp and clear because clarity conveyed authenticity. The cleaner the photograph, the more it liked professional interior design documentation, the more real it seemed. She didn't anticipate what would happen when someone took one of those details and searched for it. It started absurdly with a throw pillow. A woman named Hannah, a follower from San Francisco, was looking at a photograph of the influencer in a penthouse living room. The pillow caught her attention because she'd been shopping for pillows, and the color was exactly what she'd been looking for. It was a pale blue-gray with a subtle geometric pattern. She looked at it more closely. She recognized the pattern. It was from a specific design company that she'd purchased from before. The pillow was distinctive enough that she could identify it. Hannah searched for that pillow in the photograph's metadata and found the Airbnb listing where the photograph had been taken. The cost, $4,200 per night. The minimum booking, 4 hours. Hannah then looked at other photographs from the influencer's feed and began a project that she found oddly compulsive, trying to identify locations based on details. It took 3 hours of work, but she found another photograph that contained the same pillow, the same pale blue-gray, with the same geometric pattern. But the room was different. The view out the window was different. The walls were a different color, and yet the pillow was identical. This shouldn't be possible if these were different homes. But it was possible if they were different Airbnbs that happened to use the same designer for their staging. Hannah did more research. She found a third photograph with the same pillow, then a fourth. She searched Airbnb listings for rentals in the influencer's city that used pillows matching this description, and she found 7 different listings that contained some version of this pillow. None of them were in homes that the influencer claimed to own. All of them were rental properties, available for $3,000 to $5,000 per night. Hannah posted her findings on Reddit. The post was titled, "I found something weird in the influencer's photos." It included side-by-side comparisons of the photographs, with the pillow highlighted. The post received 200 likes, then 500, then 2,000. People started doing their own research. Someone identified abstract painting that appeared in multiple photographs. Someone else traced the marble countertop to a hotel in Dubai. Someone found a floor plan online that matched one of her photographs exactly and cross-referenced it with an Airbnb listing. Within hours, the research had expanded exponentially. The internet had developed a hypothesis. The influencer wasn't living in these spaces. She was renting them for short periods and photographing herself in them as if they were her homes. The evidence began to accumulate. Followers compared timestamps and found photographs that claimed to be from the same penthouse taken on different dates, but with slight variations in the background that suggested the furniture had been moved or changed. Someone analyzed the light patterns and determined that photographs from the same location had been taken on different days of the week at different times of day, suggesting they weren't actually taken on the schedule she claimed. Someone else found a booking confirmation for one of the Airbnbs and noticed that the influencer had rented it for exactly 4 hours on the date she claimed to have moved in. The deception, once identified, became unraveled backward. Followers began to question everything. They went back through months of photographs, looking for the seams in the story. They found that the apartment she claimed to have occupied for a year had the same furniture arrangement in pictures taken 7 months apart, which meant either the furniture had never been rearranged or the pictures were taken in a short period and posted over an extended timeline. Someone with expertise in real estate identified that several of the homes she'd claimed to own would have cost several $1,000,000 each. But her stated income, even at the most generous interpretation of her brand partnerships, could not account for the purchase of a single one of them, let alone multiple properties. Other followers began to test the narrative directly. A woman named Priya, who had once attended the same university as the influencer, looked through her college photographs. The influencer's face was recognizable, but her presentation was radically different. In the college photos, she looked uncertain, unsure of herself at the margins of social groups. The transformation was so complete that Priya wondered if this was even the same person. The narrative that the internet constructed, once it began looking, was damning and comprehensive. The influencer had not simply exaggerated her life or curated it more carefully than others. She had fabricated it entirely. Every photograph of a home she'd claimed to own was actually a rental. Every photograph of a luxury good was either a brand partnership she was being paid to feature or something she'd purchased and later returned. The luxury vacation to a private island had been to an Airbnb that could be rented for $2,000 per week. The designer wardrobe had been loans from rental services that she'd returned after photograph. The pieces connected. The pillow connected to the apartment connected to the booking connected to the timeline connected to other bookings. The bookings connected to a pattern of rental behavior that suggested she was running an intensive operation of location acquisition, photography production, and content distribution, all designed to create the appearance of a life she didn't live. Once the investigation found its critical mass, it became self-reinforcing. Every new discovery validated the hypothesis. Every new photograph that someone identified as being from a rental property added to the evidence. The narrative shifted on the internet from she curated her life more carefully than most to she has elaborately deceived millions of people. And the transformation of her identity was complete. She was no longer an influencer who'd been a bit selective about what she shared. She was a fraud. She was a scammer. She was someone who had stolen the attention, the money, the emotional investment of millions of people. And she had done so deliberately, systematically, and with premeditation. The internet didn't see a complex human being. It saw a villain. The brands that had paid her began to realize they'd been party to the deception. They'd recommended her products to audiences that she'd lied to. They'd paid her for engagement based on metrics that she'd inflated. They'd built campaigns around an image that was fundamentally false. They issued statements expressing betrayal. They demanded refunds. They began to calculate the damage to their own reputations. The followers, confronted with undeniable evidence of deception, experienced a particular kind of grief. Not the grief of loss, but the grief of misdirection. They'd been aspiring towards something that didn't exist. They'd been using their money and their emotional energy to support someone who'd been deceiving them. They'd formed a parasocial relationship with someone who wasn't real, not because she was fictional, but because the person they thought they knew was fundamentally constructed as a performance designed to manipulate them. Some followers were angry. They felt stupid, taken advantage of, violated. Some followers were disappointed, having to confront the possibility that the life they'd been aspiring toward was impossible, that there was no template for it, that they'd been following a ghost. Some followers, interestingly, felt relieved. If the image was false, then the standard it represented was false, and they were no longer failing to meet it. If the life was constructed, then they were no longer inadequate for not having achieved it. The lie, once exposed, became almost a gift. It freed them from the burden of believing in an impossible aspiration. The influencer, when she finally addressed the accusations, posted a statement on her Instagram account. "I never claimed to own these spaces. I celebrate beautiful design and beautiful moments. I share what inspires me. I'm sorry if anyone felt misled." The statement was technically true in some ways and false in others. She had implied ownership. She had photographed the spaces as if she lived in them. The implication was the deception, even if the explicit claim was absent. But by then, the narrative had moved beyond her control. She was no longer the protagonist of her own story. She had become a character in a larger narrative about authenticity and deception, about the gap between image and reality, about the price paid by people who invest their attention in cultivated illusions. Can you see the moment where the details become undeniable, where the contradiction becomes so concrete that rationalization becomes impossible? What happens to the self-image of someone who has been entirely constructed when the construction is exposed? The unraveling happened at digital speed, but the aftermath happened in real time. Within 48 hours of Hannah's initial Reddit post, the influencer had lost 1.2 million followers. Her engagement rate dropped from 8.3% to less than 1%. Comments on her posts shifted from admiration to accusation. Each new post she tried to share became a platform for people to articulate their anger and betrayal. Brands began to distance themselves. The luxury jewelry company that had launched her career issued a statement. "We were deceived about the nature of our partnership and the authenticity of the account. We are investigating whether legal action is appropriate." Other brands followed. Law firms that specialized in consumer fraud began evaluating whether they had cases. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, began an investigation into whether she'd properly disclosed that her posts were sponsored content, a violation that, in the United States, can result in substantial fines. The financial machinery that had been sustaining her collapsed. The income stopped immediately. Brands canceled partnerships. Hotels that had offered free stays revoked future invitations. The credit card companies that had been extending her credit based on her claimed income began to demand payment. The debt that she'd been servicing through brand partnership income became suddenly unpayable. She had accumulated approximately $400,000 in debt by the time the investigation began. Some of it was legitimate credit card debt. Some of it was loans obtained through fraudulent income documentation. Some of it was legal fees she'd immediately had to incur. She was facing potential criminal charges for fraud and wire fraud. She was facing civil lawsuits from brands. She was facing potential bankruptcy. The social consequences were equally severe. In the initial days, her family learned the truth about what she'd been doing by reading it on the internet. Her parents, who had believed their daughter was a successful entrepreneur, discovered instead that she was a liar who defrauded millions of people. They were humiliated. They were angry. The relationship between them became strained in ways that might never be repaired. Her friends, the people she'd had actual relationships with, had to navigate the strange space between the person they knew and the person the internet had created through the narrative of deception. The friends who knew that she'd been financially struggling while presenting as wealthy felt betrayed. The friends who had envied her based on her Instagram felt foolish for having believed the image. The friends who had supported her before the exposure were now potentially complicit in the deception by association. She couldn't leave her apartment without encountering people who recognized her, people who had lost money, who had made decisions based on her recommendations, who had aspired to her aesthetic and were now confronting the fact that aspiration had been built on a lie. Some people were vindictive. Some people wanted to understand. Most people wanted to witness the fall of someone who had been elevated. The psychological impact on her was presumably catastrophic. She had spent years constructing an identity that had become, in some sense, more real to her than her actual self. She had trained herself to think and act and present in a specific way. She had invested her entire sense of self-worth in the image. The exposure of the deception was not just social ruin. It was a kind of existential annihilation. The person that the internet had decided she was the fraud, the liar, the deceiver was now the only identity available to her. The constructed identity had been stripped away, but nothing authentic remained to take its place. In the weeks after the exposure, she made an attempt to explain herself. She posted a longer statement on her Instagram account. I didn't set out to deceive anyone. I was insecure about who I was, and I created an image of who I wanted to be. The image became more important to me than the truth. I became trapped in the lie because admitting the truth would have meant losing everything. I know that doesn't excuse what I did. It doesn't undo the damage, but it's the truth, and I'm trying to live in that truth now. The statement was met with skepticism. Critics pointed out that even this apology was performative. She was still managing her image, still trying to control the narrative, still protecting herself. The apology was seen as further evidence of deception. How could someone apologize for being unable to distinguish between authenticity and performance while still engaging in performance? The apology itself became part of the accusation. What made the reckoning particularly painful was the irreversibility of it. In the days and weeks after exposure, she couldn't find a way forward that didn't require either continuing the deception or accepting complete social erasure. Returning to her authentic self was impossible. There was no authentic self available. Only the person who had spent years deceiving people. Admitting the full extent of the fraud was impossible. It would invite legal consequences she couldn't afford. Moving forward as if the exposure had never happened was impossible. The internet had made sure it would never be forgotten. The followers experienced their own reckoning. Some of them realized how much money they'd spent trying to replicate aspects of her life. Some of them realized that decisions they'd made, purchasing items, visiting locations, making financial sacrifices, had been based on false information. Some of them felt embarrassed that they'd been taken in. Some of them felt the sting of violation, having given emotional attention to someone who'd been deliberately manipulating them. But there was also something darker. As the narrative crystallized around the idea of her as a fraudster, some followers became invested in her punishment. They wanted her to suffer. They wanted the exposure to be as humiliating and total as possible. They felt that they'd been wronged and that she deserved whatever social consequences would result. The parasocial relationship that had been based on admiration transformed, for some, into a parasocial relationship based on righteous anger. They were still emotionally invested in her, still thinking about her constantly, still following her accounts and reading her posts, but now they were doing it to monitor her and to feel validated in their judgment of her. The internet's collective investigation that had exposed her became, in the aftermath, a form of vigilante justice. The lines between legitimate accountability and cruel punishment became blurred. Some of the content circulating about her was true. Some of it was speculation. Some of it was fiction that people had created to fill in gaps they didn't understand. The narrative of the fraud was accurate, but the narrative of who she was, monster or victim, intentional deceiver or desperate person in over her head, was contested and contested endlessly on social media. She attempted, briefly, to rebuild a kind of authentic presence. She posted photographs of her actual life, the apartment she was living in that she could actually afford, the job she was working in, the person she was trying to become if she could separate that person from the constructed image. The photographs got fewer engagement, and the comments were largely hostile. People accused her of faking authenticity, of performing vulnerability, of continuing to deceive in new forms. She deleted her Instagram account. The deletion was interpreted as an admission of guilt. She attempted to return to normal life, though normal life, for someone with her level of notoriety, was impossible. She was recognized in public. Her story was picked up by podcasters, true crime commentators, and people who had built their own followings on analyzing and discussing her fraud. She had become a case study, a cautionary tale, a symbol of something larger about digital deception and influencer culture. The brands that had paid her pursued legal action. They sued her for recovery of funds, for damages to their reputations, for the cost of advertising that had been tainted by association with her deception. Some of these lawsuits would likely be successful. Some of them would take years to resolve. The financial institution that had extended her credit pursued collection. They began garnishing any income she was able to earn. They offered her settlement options if she would consent to public disclosure of her fraud, which would further damage her reputation, but also further resolve her debt. A lawyer suggested she consider bankruptcy. Bankruptcy would, at least, provide a reset point. It would acknowledge that she couldn't pay her debts, and it would clear the slate in a legal sense, if not a social one. But bankruptcy would also mean admitting publicly the total extent of her financial fraud. It would mean acknowledging, in court documents, how much money she'd obtained through deception. What remained of her, once the construction had been stripped away, was a woman in her mid-20s with severe trauma, significant debt, a criminal investigation pending, civil lawsuits outstanding, and a digital footprint that would ensure she would never be forgotten as anything other than a cautionary tale. One might ask, did she deserve this? The question of deservingness is complex, because it depends on whether we're talking about proportional consequences or absolute justice. If the harm she caused is measured in emotional manipulation, wasted time, financial loss, and the betrayal of trust, then is total social annihilation a proportional response, or is it excessive? If we're measuring only the direct financial fraud, the money brands paid her for sponsored content, the money she charged Airbnb's rental fees, and the actual dollar amount of direct theft is perhaps $200,000 to $300,000. The civil lawsuits would recover some of this. Prison time might be a consequence, but prison time measured in years seems potentially disproportionate to the financial crime. Yet the internet, in its judgment, had decided that the appropriate consequence was something beyond legal punishment. It was social erasure, permanent reputation damage, and the kind of notoriety that would follow her for the rest of her life. Every future employer would find her story online. Every person she met could, with a simple search, learn that she was the influencer who had defrauded millions. Every relationship she tried to form would be shadowed by the knowledge of what she'd done. This is what happens when justice is delivered by the internet rather than by the law. The punishment is often more severe than what a court would impose, and it's also more irreversible. A prison sentence ends, but a permanent digital record of your crime and exposure doesn't end. It lasts forever. She had built a prison out of her own deception, and when the deception was exposed, that prison became visible to everyone. She was no longer incarcerated in the lie. She was incarcerated in the truth. What does it mean when the mechanisms of justice become indistinguishable from the mechanisms of cruelty? When exposure of wrongdoing transforms into permanent punishment for a human being? We want to believe in the possibility of redemption. We want to believe that someone who has done wrong can become right again, that deception can be acknowledged and forgiven, that a person can be rebuilt from the ruins of what they've constructed and destroyed. We want these things because we are all, in some sense, constructed from lies, the small fictions we tell ourselves about who we are and what we deserve. If redemption is impossible for her, then perhaps it's impossible for any of us. But what does redemption look like for someone who has defrauded millions of people? Not through violence or theft in the traditional sense, but through the manipulation of image, through the hijacking of attention, through the conversion of emotional investment into financial benefit. What is owed to the people who were deceived? The influencer, as the investigation concluded, had not technically stolen money in the way we typically understand theft. The brands had paid her voluntarily in exchange for what they believed was authentic endorsement. The followers had followed her voluntarily, in exchange for what they believed was a glimpse into a real life. No one was forced at gunpoint to transfer funds or attention. The transactions happened through mutual agreement, even if that agreement was based on false information. Yet something was clearly taken. The followers had paid with their time, their emotional attention, their faith. They had made decisions financial, life-directional, psychological, based on false information. They had formed attachments to someone who wasn't real in the sense that mattered most. The person they thought they knew was constructed deliberately to be different from the person who actually existed. The influencer's defense, in various forms, relied on a kind of philosophical relativism. Everyone curates. Everyone presents a version of themselves that's different from their full, authentic selves. The difference between what she'd done and what everyone does is one of degree, not kind. But this argument misses something crucial. It's true that everyone curates. The difference is in the intentionality and the scale of the deception. When a person presents a carefully edited version of their life on social media, they are typically still showing their actual life, just the good parts. When the influencer presented a carefully edited version of her life, she was showing a life that didn't exist. The curation was not of her actual life, but of a fictional life, constructed entirely to create a specific impression. There's also a question about power and leverage. When millions of people have agreed to be influenced by your image, you have power. You have the power to shape desires, to direct consumption, to validate or invalidate certain ways of being in the world. With that power comes responsibility. The influencer had chosen not to acknowledge that responsibility. She had treated her power as if it were simply a tool for self-promotion, not recognizing that it came with obligations to the people she'd influenced. Yet understanding this doesn't actually solve the problem of what comes next. What is the path forward for someone who has built their entire identity around a deception, who has no skills or credentials that exist independent of that deception, who has accumulated significant debt in the process of maintaining the deception, and who now exists in a kind of permanent state of social pariah? The question of her psychological state is also essential. It's possible that she did intentionally set out to deceive people, that she was malevolent in her creation of a false image. It's also possible that she was so psychologically fragmented that the distinction between the constructed self and the actual self had collapsed, that she believed her own image, that she wasn't aware she was deceiving anyone, because in her own consciousness, the image had become the person. Psychological fragmentation of this kind is a real phenomenon. It's often associated with trauma, with profound insecurity, with a kind of dissociation from the authentic self that happens when someone has spent so long performing a role that the role and the person have merged. If this was the case, and there's some evidence to suggest it might have been, then holding her entirely responsible as a deliberate deceiver might be unjust. It might also mean that the appropriate response is not punishment, but treatment. This is uncomfortable for the people who want her to suffer, because it suggests that she might have been as much a victim of the deception as the people she deceived. She created the deception, yes, but the deception also created her. She built a prison out of her own lies, and then she lived in that prison for years, unable to escape, because leaving would mean admitting the entire structure was false. The parasocial followers experienced a related phenomenon. They were deceived, but they were also willing participants in the deception. They wanted to believe. They constructed narratives that allowed them to keep believing, even when contradictions appeared. They performed their own kind of deception of themselves, agreeing to ignore evidence that would have complicated the narrative they'd invested in. None of this absolves anyone of responsibility. It simply complicates the idea that responsibility is absolute and unidirectional. If we're looking for a person or an institution to blame, we could blame the influencer for deliberately constructing a false image. We could blame the followers for being willing to believe in the image without verification. We could blame the brands for trusting metrics and follower counts instead of conducting due diligence. We could blame Instagram and other platforms for creating systems that reward aesthetic appeal and engagement over authenticity. We could blame capitalism for creating a system in which the ability to convince people to want things is more valuable and the ability to create things of actual value. The truth is probably all of these things, distributed across many actors, many systems, many choices. Responsibility isn't singular. It's distributed. What seems most important in the aftermath is to acknowledge several truths simultaneously. First, the influencer deliberately constructed a false image and benefited financially from that deception. She is responsible for that choice and its consequences. Second, the followers were deceived, and their anger and sense of betrayal are legitimate. They had the right to expect honesty from someone they were investing their attention and money into. Third, the followers also participated, at some level, in the deception by wanting to believe and constructing narratives that allowed them to overlook contradictions. Fourth, the systems that enabled and rewarded this kind of deception platforms, brands, the attention economy itself, are complicit. Fifth, the response of the internet, which was to expose the deception and collectively punish the influencer, was both justice and cruelty, accurate in its identification of fraud and excessive in its consequences. The question of whether redemption is possible for her is open-ended. She could acknowledge the full extent of her deception. She could attempt to rebuild a life based on honesty and authenticity, accepting that such a life would be much smaller, much less visible, much less lucrative than the constructed one. She could work to make amends, though the scale of amends required by the scale of deception is hard to imagine. She could participate in a genuine reckoning, not a performance of reckoning, with what she'd done and who she'd hurt. But all of this would require her to accept her own psychological fragmentation and to rebuild an actual self from the rubble of the constructed one. This is extraordinarily difficult psychological work. It's possible that she's never done it, that she's continued to reconstruct her image, just in different venues and different platforms. What the story of this influencer reveals about all of us is something worth examining. It reveals that we are all, to some extent, constructing images of ourselves. We are all curating. We are all presenting versions of ourselves that are different from our full reality. The question is one of degree and intention. Are we presenting a carefully selected version of our actual lives, or are we constructing entirely false lives? Are we being deceptive for profit and attention, or are we simply engaging in the normal human behavior of self-presentation? It also reveals that we want to believe in people, that we form attachments to images and narratives, that we are willing to overlook contradictions if the image we're being presented is compelling enough and aligns well enough with what we want to believe. We are all, in this sense, parasocial consumers of image. We all have the capacity to be deceived because deception meets psychological needs in us. And it reveals that the internet, in its power to expose and to punish, is both an instrument of justice and an instrument of cruelty. The exposure of her deception was just as people had the right to know that what they were investing in wasn't real. The permanent punishment, the total social annihilation, the conversion of her from a person to a cautionary tale that is something more complicated. If there's a lesson in this story, it's not simply don't lie. It's also not be careful what you believe on the internet, though that's true. The lesson is more structural. The systems we've built, the attention economy, the celebrity system, the platforms that reward engagement over authenticity, the culture that measures worth in followers and likes, these systems create the conditions for this kind of deception. They create the incentives, they create the possibility, and they create the audience hungry to believe. She was one person, making choices within a system that incentivized those choices. She is responsible for her choices. But the system is also responsible for creating the conditions in which those choices seemed rational, viable, necessary. What remains of her when the lie collapses is a person like many others, broken, frightened, trying to understand how they became someone they didn't intend to be. The difference is that her becoming is public, documented, permanent. The difference is that millions of people have watched her fall and are still watching, still discussing, still processing what her fall means about the nature of authenticity, celebrity, and the human capacity for self-deception. Have you ever looked at someone's carefully curated image and wondered about the gap between what you were seeing and what was actually true? Have you ever realized that someone you thought you knew was something other than what they presented themselves to be? Have you ever recognized in someone else's deception the shape of your own lies? The story of the influencer is her story, but it's also a mirror, and what we choose to see when we look into it says something about who we are. And remember, Velvet Traps exists to explore the psychology of deception, not to celebrate it. If you have a story about trust, betrayal, or the masks we wear, send it to velvettraps@gmail.com. These stories help us understand ourselves and each other. Every submission is read. Your experience is part of this investigation. If this psychological exploration resonated with you, leave a like. Share with someone who loves understanding human nature. Subscribe new explorations of deception and psychology every week. Thank you for watching.